This project was released as part of the project InclusiveGameLab, which was funded by the German Ministry of Research, Technology and Space, and realized by the University of Applied Sciences Cologne and the Department for Youth Media Culture. In the next two sessions, we will focus on assistive technology and its use for gaming. First, let's have a look at the changes in game controller designs over the years, because this development has had a strong impact on game accessibility. As it was the case with the games themselves, gaming hardware also tended to be more accessible in the earlier years of gaming, because input devices had fewer buttons to press or sticks to move. But of course, there were limitations as well. The earliest gamepads with rotary controls were difficult to use for people with motor impairments, as were devices with very small buttons like the gamepad of the Nintendo Entertainment System. In addition, devices like the Nintendo Power Glove were inaccessible for many, not just disabled players, because they were designed for right-handed people. However, when the first joysticks were introduced, the gaming market suddenly opened up to many people with motor impairments who previously couldn't play. Not only was the joystick marketed and quickly adapted as a generic control device, meaning that it was compatible with a wide range of games, it was also similar to the devices used to operate assistive medical devices like motorized wheelchairs. This means many people with disabilities were already familiar with them. Unfortunately, this access was revoked through the introduction of the analog stick with the release of Nintendo's N64 console in 1996. Joysticks were perfectly suited for navigation in three-dimensional space, so Nintendo adapted this technology, but implemented it in a gamepad and reduced it in size so players could control it only with their thumb. While this worked well for many players, it meant that mainstream controllers were once again difficult or impossible to operate for people with motor impairments in their upper limbs. During this time, another idea was introduced that has turned into a standard of gaming technology, just like analog sticks: haptic feedback. After Nintendo's early experiments with the N64 Rumble Pack, other manufacturers followed suit. Most notably Sony. The company's PlayStation console was initially sold with lightweight analog gamepads featuring only a D-pad and several buttons. But in 1994, Sony introduced the DualShock controller, which featured two analog sticks as well as two vibration motors, hence its name. The DualShock then quickly replaced the previous controller as the default input device. This development led to both an advancement and a step backwards in accessibility. While haptic feedback proved useful for gamers with sensory impairments who had difficulty perceiving visual or auditive feedback, it turned into a problem for players with limited muscle control. Adding motors made gamepads much heavier, and it was more difficult to hold a vibrating controller, especially for a prolonged time. Both innovations, more complex controls with analog sticks and haptic feedback, are still used today, which means the aforementioned problems persist. However, there have also been some deviations from this norm, most notably movement-based controls. In 2006, Nintendo published its Wii console and with it an entirely new type of input. Instead of a single gamepad, the controls were spread over two controllers, a remote and a so-called nunchuck, each of which was held in one hand. This input device became very popular among people with disabilities and researchers to the point where it would be used in rehabilitation programs for elderly and chronically ill people, even decades later. The Wii brought with it other challenges such as mandatory gesture and motion-based input, which created access barriers for a range of players with motor impairments. Still, it was an interesting experiment, and built upon with the Nintendo Switch, first released in 2017. The Switch supports both so-called Joy-Cons, small input devices with 2 analog sticks, several buttons and a D-pad, and the Pro Controller, a gamepad which is very similar to other contemporary input devices. Having a choice between inputs was and is useful, but many players with disabilities still struggle with the complex controls and, in the case of the Joy-Cons, with the small buttons and sticks. Fortunately, in 2021, US-based company Hori released an assistive controller which would solve many of these issues and which we'll examine in the next talk. When talking about unusual input devices developed and distributed by big publishers, it's also important to mention the Kinect. The Kinect was a line of motion-sensing input devices by Microsoft, available for their Windows operating system as well as the Xbox 360 and Xbox One. The technology used cameras, infrared projectors, and detectors to detect movement and gestures performed by the player. In addition, it contained microphones, allowing developers to implement speech recognition and voice control in their Kinect games. While the technology was very different from that of the Nintendo Wii, the Kinect also removed previously existing barriers for some impaired players and became very popular amongst researchers and caretakers of elderly people. We just covered input devices that were used industry-wide and proved more or less accessible by chance, not by design. However, gamepads, joysticks, buttons, and other devices are also developed specifically for players with impairments. Creating dedicated accessibility hardware seems like a more recent development, and the first thing that comes to mind is probably Microsoft's Adaptive Controller, which was released in 2018, but initial experiments with this kind of technology actually began much earlier. The very first accessibility device for gaming was developed by Nintendo and sold in 1989. This device was placed or strapped on the player's chest, and input worked in 2 ways. Players moved the joystick with their chin, and instead of pressing buttons, they would move air through a tube. Sipping or puffing with more or less force would then be registered by the system as A, B, select or start input. As a side note, this same sip and puff system is still used today, which you'll see when we talk about the quad stick. Distribution of the hands-free controller for Nintendo's Entertainment System, or NES, started in 1989. Unfortunately, the device was never sold in stores, only through the company's customer service line. That's likely why, according to one source, only about 100 pieces were sold in total, which makes this one of the rarest pieces of Nintendo hardware. Another reason for this low sales number was probably the price, $120, that people were asked to spend in 1989 would be equivalent to more than $300 today. So it's very likely many people simply couldn't afford it, which is a common issue with accessible gaming. After Nintendo's very early exploration of this topic, no other major game hardware manufacturer followed its lead for almost 30 years, with the Xbox Adaptive Controller being introduced to the public as late as 2018. But during this time, smaller companies as well as many individuals with or without disabilities worked on innovating controls. In 1996, Logitech introduced the ASCII Grip one-handed controller. Its layout was designed for both left-handed and right-handed players, and it worked best for classic RPGs and other turn-based games. Playing action games proved to be difficult, but was possible for some of the players' base with some practice. However, with the introduction of 3D-based games and the analog stick, the ASCII Grip soon became outdated and incompatible with many titles. Almost 12 years later, in 2008, eDimensional introduced the Access controller, which is not to be confused with the hardware of the same name that Sony started selling in 2023. The eDimensional Access controller was compatible with PlayStation 2 and 3, as well as PCs, and had a very unusual modular design. Every input device on the controller could be moved and replaced, so it allowed players to configure their own layouts. Players could put it on their leg or a flat surface, like a small table, and use it one- or two-handed. In addition, it was a wireless device and thus easier to set up for many users. The eDimensional Access controller was sold for $125. In 2011, the Able Gamers charity teamed up with a company called Evil to create an adaptive controller for the Xbox 360. The Adroid Switchblade allowed players to remap buttons, triggers, and thumbsticks from the Xbox 360 controller to a switch of their choice. So essentially, players could plug in any supported accessibility devices into the controller to change input in accordance to their personal requirements. It also offered a number of additional useful features, like up to 3 button mapping profiles that could be saved and loaded anytime. As you can gather, this piece of technology was already much more elaborate than Nintendo's hands-free controller, and out of necessity, because games and input devices had changed drastically since the late 80s. They'd become much more complex. Unfortunately, this meant that accessibility hardware was more difficult to develop now, which was reflected in the price tags. The Switchblade was sold for $400. Only 220 of these handmade devices were eventually distributed to players. Another option that was very popular for a while and is still available today are modified controllers. These are original input devices for consoles or PC, which are just changed in some ways to meet certain requirements. For example, Evil, the company that created the Switchblade in 2011, offered lightweight controllers for gamers with conditions like muscle fatigue, who might struggle carrying the weight of a regular controller for an extended period of time. Usually, this weight reduction is achieved by removing the rumble motors. In addition, customers can choose from a wide variety of modifications like thumbstick extenders or soft press buttons. These modifications lead to a lot of additional costs though, so a lightweight controller with added features can easily cost $200 to $300. The most common form of modified controllers are single-handed controllers. The modifications are much more extensive here. For example, analog sticks might be moved to the bottom of the pad so players can use them with their legs, or the button layout could be changed drastically so that every button can be reached with one hand. There are versions for both left-handed and right-handed players. These pads are usually made and sold by hobbyists. Since they are handmade and created for each customer individually, these are also relatively expensive. They cost about $300 to $400 per piece. As opposed to the early days of gaming, today we can choose from a wide range of accessible and adaptive hardware. That's great, because there are more options to choose from for gamers with different support needs. And mass production means that these devices are more affordable now. In the next talk, we'll introduce you to the most recent and popular assistive devices. These are some sources and links for further reading.